Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome and thank you for joining us today at the XRB as we workshop our Developing Assurance Standard. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Misha Peters and I am the Director of Assurance here at the XRB. Today is an interactive workshop session and we've been amazed by the level of interest today. We've got over 100 registrants, so thank you so much for expressing your interest, for joining us today and being willing to share your ideas with us as we explore and consider ways to develop an assurance standard. We will be using polling as well as the chat function today. We ask you to keep yourselves on mute and your cameras off given the large numbers in attendance. But if you do wish to ask a question, please do raise your electronic hand and turn your video on so that we can see you. That will be an indication that you wish to talk, and we'll invite you to ask your question or share your views. We've got some time available and we've got some specific slides where we sort of pause for discussion time. And we really value your contributions. As I say, this is an interactive session. We want to share with you what we're thinking about, but we're really interested in really want to hear your views as we develop our assurance standard. We do have some of our greenhouse gas advisory panel joining the session today, and I thank you again for all of your help in sharing your views with us along the journey, and also encourage you to voice your thoughts and views at any point during today's presentation. As you will have seen, I have hit record. The reason we record these sessions is because not everybody is able to attend on the day, and they often come and ask us for a recording of the session afterwards. So the slides, together with the recording, will be made available on the XRB website after today's event. We will also be sending out an email following today's event with a short survey. And that's really to ask you some follow-up questions after we've put some seeds and some thoughts in your mind about some of the ideas that we're exploring. It's a short survey. We're looking for views from users, preparers, and practitioners. And we'll email out the link to you and encourage you to please fill that out over the next week. What's on the agenda for today? We have a full agenda and I am joined by my wonderful colleagues. So we will start with an overview of the developing disclosure requirements. And Judy Ryan, our greenhouse gas emissions whiz, will take you through those. That forms the foundation and is an absolutely key part of what the assurance standard must look like, because obviously it depends on what needs to get reported as to what needs to get assured. I'll then give you a brief overview of our developing approach and give you a bit of an introduction. And then I'm going to hand over to Anna Herlander, who is a project manager on the assurance team, and she will explore some of the ethical implications with you. And then we're delighted to have Nicola Hankinson, who has been seconded to the XRB part-time specifically to assist us with this project. So we are very grateful to Nicola for joining us, helping us, and she is going to help take us through the developing requirements on assurance reporting, as well as the quality management requirements. And as I mentioned, we'll follow up today's session with a survey. So I'll hand over to Judy at this point to take you through the disclosure requirements.
Nā mihi ki a koe I tō whakatingakinga. Kia ora koutou katoa, ko Judy Ryan toko ingoa. I'm going to give you the high-level overview of most of the proposed Aotearoa New Zealand climate standards with detail, well, not really most of the standards, with detail on the greenhouse gas emissions disclosures. So when we issue the first climate standard, the climate-related disclosures will be mandatory for large listed companies, large listed insurers, registered banks, credit unions, building societies, and managers of investment schemes with more than 1 billion in assets, so around about 200 entities, we think. Misha, if we could have the next slide, please. So there are 3 standards in the framework. First, NZCS 1, this is where the 4 disclosure areas are: governance, strategy, risk management, metrics and targets. So metrics and targets include those greenhouse gas emissions. It also has the mandatory assurance scope that's required over the greenhouse gas emissions. NZCS2 is a limited number of first-time adoption provisions, and at the moment the exposure draft proposes a 1-year adoption provision for Scope 3, and then NZCS3, which is the overall general requirements. It's really important that it has got the methodologies, assumptions and uncertainties in that part of the framework. So next slide, please, Misha. The greenhouse gas emissions disclosures, remembering these are just one of the 8 cross-industry metrics. The proposals are for the disclosure of gross greenhouse gas emissions, and then we've made that gross emissions a defined term, which means excluding purchase, sale and transfer, and using the location-based methodology for your Scope 2 emissions. Reporting any removals you want to would be done separately. So we've asked for the gross number. Next slide, please, Misha. There are some additional requirements around the proposed greenhouse gas emissions disclosures. So recognising that NZCS1 isn't a measurement standard, it's a disclosure standard. So we are asking people to describe how they're measuring them. So which recognised standard or standards are you using to measure your greenhouse gas emissions? We're thinking that's the Greenhouse Gas Protocol and or ISO 14064 part 1. So that choice is up to the entity, which greenhouse gas emissions consolidation approach they've used, the equity share, financial control, operational control, and a summary of specific exclusions with a justification for the exclusions of what's been missed. And Misha, if you can just hit the click again, I think. Well, yep. So just a reminder that there is that 1-year exemption in NZCS2 that's optional for disclosing Scope 3. That's the proposals at this point in time. We're still waiting for feedback on that. And then just the next slide, just to remind everyone what is Scope 3. That's the full value chain upstream and downstream. And a lot of New Zealand entities that have been measuring Scope 3 to date have only included business travel, waste and possibly freight, but we're looking at that whole purchase goods and services, capital goods, right down to end of life treatment and use of sold products. So the whole value chain. And the reason for this is the CDP has said that they think that these emissions are around 11 times greater than direct emissions for an entity, and this is where the largest risks and opportunities lie. So we're really keen for the entities in this regime to really get a full picture of where they're at, which is why that's been included. So next slide. NZCS3 is like kind of the overarching standard, even though it's number 3. It contains the principles and also general requirements like materiality, comparatives and methodologies and assumptions. And we have some specific methodologies and assumptions criteria for the greenhouse gas emissions. So next slide, and I've just kind of highlighted or very highly summarized them here, but basically what methodologies and significant assumptions have you used and what are the limitations of those? So, and again, what if they've made choices, which methods they've used and why, and then describe significant uncertainties and including the effect of these on the disclosures, and in kind of an aside, an explanation for any base year greenhouse gas emissions restatements. We've pulled these disclosure requirements from the reporting requirements we found in Greenhouse Gas Protocol, ISO 14064, and also ISAE 30. NZ 3410. That was a variety of numbers there. And then lastly, the last thing that I wanted to cover was the proposed assurance requirements. So we've the exposure draft proposes limited assurance. There was pretty strong agreement on that first time round. I don't think that's going to change. Reporting periods that end on or after the 27th of October 2024. So for most entities that are in the regime from the start, that would be their second reporting period. And the assurance engagement will cover the greenhouse gas emissions, the 1, 2, 3, and the additional requirements that we've just walked through, plus those methodologies, assumptions, and estimations, uncertainties in NZCS3. But also remembering that NZCS3, the other requirements like materiality and comparatives apply right across the standard. and any and all of the disclosures as well. Sorry, Misha, that's next slide's good. So just a reminder to everyone, that's currently out as an exposure draft. We have changed the consultation closure date to the 27th of September at midday now, given that Monday the 26th is now a public holiday. So, but we would love to hear from you, any format. It doesn't have to be a full formal submission. If you email us or anything else, we will just add that into our pile. We appreciate people are busy, so any feedback is good, and we will we'll take what we can get. Yeah, so Misha's now trying to develop her assurance standard without being 100% sure what's going to be in our actual standard, but that's what we're proposing at this stage. Thanks, Misha.
Super, thank you so much, Judy. It's a key part, as you mentioned, of our assurance standard. Really is dependent on what those reporting requirements look like. So next, and the bulk of today's session is really exploring what the assurance standard should cover. And I thought we'd start by recapping on, why this project and our key objectives. So we have this wonderful act, the Financial Sector Climate-Related Disclosures and Other Matters Amendment Act. It's quite a mouthful, so I'm just going to call it the Act. The Act requires mandatory assurance over those greenhouse gas emission disclosures that Judy's just covered. And the key assurance implications, as Judy mentioned, is that mandatory assurance kicks in from November 2024. So it's basically your second round of reporting. And the mandatory assurance must be undertaken in accordance with XRB's assurance standards. So our project is really in place to develop an assurance standard to meet the requirement of this Act. So our objectives are on this slide. I'll give you a second or two to read those. A key part of our objectives is that we recognise that for this regime, this is the first time that some professionals will be required to comply with XRB's assurance standards. So to develop this set of standards, we have started right from the start and gone, okay, let's stand back and do a fit for purpose review of our existing relevant assurance standards. And we've spent a number of months learning and comparing our existing XRB assurance standards, which are largely based on the standards issued by the International Auditing and Assurance Standards Board and the International Ethics Standards Board for Professional Accountants. That's historically where we've taken our standards from. But in this regime, we recognise that there's other internationally recognised assurance standards. So we've spent some time comparing, learning, and understanding all of these other assurance standards. And what this process has taught us is that we actually have much to learn from each other as we continue to develop this standard. And we are committed to working closely with all competent assurance practitioners. And that fits nicely into our objective of making sure that we are not creating unnecessary barriers and that our standards are accessible and usable for all practitioners. But underlying all of this at the end of the day is why is there mandatory assurance over this? Is because we want to enable trust and confidence in that disclosure. And so we want to ensure that we have consistent, high quality assurance engagements. So that's the why and our objectives. In terms of our timeline, we are aiming, and we know that we have this mandatory regime coming at us from October 2024. So that gives us a little bit more time than the climate team has to finalise their standard, but it doesn't allow us too much time. So we are aiming at issuing an exposure draft in December. That's a little bit later than what we have previously signalled. Our original intent about 18 months ago was aiming for an exposure draft in October, but recognising that the reporting requirements themselves are not finalised yet, we thought it prudent to wait till December to issue our exposure draft. It's not the ideal time. We know you're all going to be sitting on the beach over Christmas, but we aim to issue our exposure draft before you hit the beach. And if you're that keen and interested, you can take our exposure draft with you, read it on the beach. But if you really want to wait till February, we completely understand that. And we will run our consultation period to close in sometime in March. And that, all things going well, will enable us to issue a standard in June 2023, well in advance of the October 24 mandatory regime. So just some context in terms of how we've gone about and the factors that are driving our approach that we're planning on adopting. We are developing an assurance standard in the context of a rapidly evolving space. So there are 4 factors that it really feels a bit like us, that the ground beneath our feet is moving. And every day that ground moves a little bit more, and we're adapting, and we're trying to be agile to a very changeable world. We have the reporting requirements that are not yet finalised. We expect the scope of mandatory assurance to rapidly expand. So some people might voluntarily seek assurance beyond the greenhouse gas numbers, but we also expect in due course that the mandatory regime will cover more, or if not all, of the climate statements. Standard setters globally are similarly scrambling to recognise that assurance plays a key role in enabling trust and confidence in this climate or sustainability type reporting. So the global assurance and ethical standard setters are currently actively working away, recognising that the standards that we have to date have some gaps. They need to be filled, they need to be addressed. And so the standards that we have in place today, while they're not broken, there are enhancements that can be made specific for this regime. And the other fact to bear in mind is that the oversight regime over assurance practitioners is still unknown and expected to develop. So given all of those 4 factors, we stood back and we had the shifting ground beneath our feet feeling for quite some time. And we reflected on that and thought, well, actually, let's do something a bit different here. Let's explicitly recognise that the world is changing. Let's develop a standard that is temporary. So we are going to develop a standard with an effective date that matches the Act, but we plan to actually have an end date for this temporary solution. So it's just going to fill the gap while all of these factors that are moving around us has some time to settle down. Once we have visibility on where all of these factors are landing, then we'll be able to come up with a more long-term solution. We are also very focused, therefore, on a narrow scope standard that is only focused on the mandatory assurance under the Act. So it will only be for the greenhouse gas disclosures required in the climate statements under the Act. So that's our plan of action, and that's the why we've sort of adopted that approach. So what are the key features in this funny little standard that we're developing? And I'm going to caveat it that today it is going to look a bit strange because it's going to cover engagement level requirements, it's going to cover ethics, and it's going to cover quality management all in one standard. So that's, in the first place, going to look a little bit different from the standards that we all are used to. As mentioned, we've undertaken a comparison of our assurance standards issued by the IAASB and the IESBA, for those of you who follow those standards, and also of the ISO standards, because we understand that there are a number of practitioners in New Zealand who follow those standards. And as we've gone along that journey, we've recognised that for a temporary solution, it makes sense to recognise both of these well-established international standards and then layer any additional requirements specific for this regime on either of those platforms. So the key aspect of our developing standard is that we will require compliance with either ISAE 3410 or ISO 14064. We will require compliance with the ethical requirements that are required by professional bodies such as NZECA's Code of Ethics or JASAN's accreditation requirements. We will require compliance with those similar professional quality requirements. And then we were going to layer specific requirements over and above those. This approach does require us to actually deactivate 2 of our XRB's existing standards. That is PES1, our Code of Ethics, and PES3, our Quality Management Standards. And that's because we're saying, well, you have to follow your ethical professional requirements. What we're going to do in this standard is layer additional ethical and quality management requirements, which we have identified, with your help, of course, as to be specifically relevant for this regime. So we continue to learn every day. We're finding new requirements, considering the relevance of what to layer. It requires quite a lot of judgment. It requires a lot of learning and understanding. And that's the purpose of our event today, is to continue along that journey. So we hope that this will be an interactive session. We're going to break it up into those 3 sort of aspects: ethics, quality management, and then the engagement level requirements. Specifically, we've identified assurance reporting as a key aspect to layer, because that is going to be the outcome that the user is going to see. Without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Anna to talk you through the ethics.
Thank you, Misha. Good morning. My name is Anna Herlander, and I am a project manager at XRB. Recently, I have been working on drafting a greenhouse gas assurance standard, and today I would like to present you the part of the standard that will relate to ethics and independence. So on this slide, you can see a draft structure of our ethics part of the standard. But before we start talking about any details, we should keep in mind that all assurance practitioners have already their professional requirements. So the professional requirements exist outside of XRB standards, and we are not deactivating them. We are layering our requirements on top of the professional requirements. So in this way, we would like to ensure that there is a consistent approach among assurance practitioners when they provide the greenhouse gas emissions assurance. So the structure, the draft structure of our ethics part of the standard includes a recognition that practitioners need to comply with fundamental principles and threats and safeguards approach. Then we identified some specific circumstances that are of so huge importance that they need to be explicitly included in our standard, and we will include prohibition of specific services and situations in the standard. And finally, we are still considering and exploring what other areas we should consider, and if anything else we should include in our standard. If you have a chance and you are so kind to complete our survey, it would be a huge help for us so that we could see your feedback and your views, what other ethics and independence measures are important for you. So when we go to the next slide, it's just a quick overall approach that we are applying in our standards. So we will require that all assurance practitioners needs to comply with fundamental principles: independence, integrity, objectivity, professional competence and due care, confidentiality, and professional behavior. And assurance practitioners need to identify if there are any threats to fundamental principles, and they should eliminate or reduce these threats to an acceptable level. And we will also have a explanation in our standard that an acceptable level would be what a third objective party would think, knowing all the facts and circumstances and having all the knowledge. Would they conclude that assurance practitioner complied with fundamental principles? So we will have a first question to start our interactive session, and I call it like a warm-up question. Do you think that we should define the fundamental principles of threats in our standard, or do you think it's they are commonly understood, and because we are just layering on top of professional requirements, we don't need to explain fundamental principles anymore? So we will wait for half a minute or for a minute for the responses. So I can see that now 74% of the participants responded to our poll. And looks like the results are not moving anymore. Okay, so I suppose we can close the poll now at this stage. So it's really interesting result, because majority of us think that we should define the fundamental principles, and only 13% said that we don't need to define them anymore, and 15% is unsure. Thank you very much for your feedback. It's really interesting thing, food for thoughts for us, and we will consider your feedback when we are still refining our standard. I'm just wondering if there's anything that any of you would like to comment or provide any context. You could either comment or just leave some words in the chat box. All right, I suppose if there are no comments, let's have a look at more of the details that we are proposing in our standard. So based on what we have heard from many sources during many discussions so far, we identified two areas that would be extremely important for this assurance regime. One is a possibility of providing services by assurance practitioners other than assurance, and that these services might create a self-review threat. This self-review threat could be created, for example, when an assurance practitioner provided an IT solution that is used by the assurance client, and later assurance practitioner comes and does the assurance work of the results that came out from that software. So we are thinking to be very strict and very precise in the standard to show that, like, if there's any possibility that a service might create a self-review threat, including any technology solutions, this service then then the assurance practitioner is not allowed to provide the services. And another principle-based requirement would be prohibition of assumption of management responsibility. So, for example, taking responsibility for preparing greenhouse gas disclosures, taking responsibility for directing employees of the assurance client, setting some sort of policies or directions for the assurance client. And when we were looking at this principle-based requirements, a discussion emerged if shall we include explicit requirements. So this is not principle-based, but this is very, very explicit. Shall we prohibit preparation of the greenhouse gas disclosures? Some might think that this is already included in the principles, but some might think that this is of such importance, or this is not very clear that this is included in the principles, that it is better that it would be that an explicit requirement would be included in the standard. So it would be very interesting if we could have any discussion about this, but to start the discussion, we will have a poll again. So we prepared a polling questions, so everyone could vote yes or no or unsure, and hopefully it will start any comments from the audience. So let's have a look at these questions. And when you see the poll window, when you scroll down, you can see the third question. So we will wait a little bit longer because so far about 40 people responded. We have today 63 participants, so let's see if anyone else would like to respond. All right, so I can see that, sorry, that poll ended, and these are the results. So 77% supports prohibition of self-review threat, and 64% support prohibition of assumption of management responsibility. 40% supports explicit prohibition of the preparation of greenhouse gas disclosures, and 34% said that this prohibition does not need to be included in the standard because it's already covered by the self-review threat. Thank you very much for these responses. We will have them saved in our recording, and we will be coming back to them when we will be considering how we need to shape our standard.
Anna, we just had one person in the chat point out that question 3 was a bit unclear in terms of yes, no, and then no as already covered by the self-review threat prohibition. So I guess in effect what we were thinking is, you know, that the no as already covered by the self-review threat, they might also be yeses, but I think you're right that that is unclear. So yeah, really good point, and we will take that into account when we think about our next steps. So thanks for raising that. We really appreciate it. And Yulia has also said answer to question 3 will depend on the answer on question 1. Yeah, 100%. Yeah, absolutely.
Yes,
Yulia,
that's right.
it's very interrelated. It's yeah, not clear cut, unfortunately.
Nevis, I see your video's on. Did you want to make a comment at all? No, all good. Just checking. Always good. We always encourage somebody to be brave. So if you wanted to have a comment, please.
No more comments. All right, so let's move to the next slide. And another prohibition that we are considering is holding financial interest in the assurance client. So it means if you have any interest in equity or debt, either directly or through any intermediary, it could be, for example, investment vehicle or trust. And if you could control the intermediary or influence its investment decisions, it would still be considered your direct interest. While if you do not have impact at all on the investment decisions, it would be your indirect interest in the assurance client. So we are proposing to prohibiting direct interest and an indirect interest that would be material to the assurance practitioner. So shall we have another question? Do you support this prohibition? And if you have any comments, you are welcome to raise them or put in the chat box.
It's pretty compelling.
Looks quite interesting. And we had 46 people who responded to this question, and 96% said yes, that they support a prohibition of financial interest, with 4% being unsure about this. Thank you very much for this feedback. If you are unsure and would like to raise any comment for us to consider or clarify anything more, please you are welcome to do it and leave us some comment. Shall we move to the next part? What else we are considering for the ethics part of our standard? So we have heard that, and we know that greenhouse gas emissions is not something new, and many professionals provided services and assurance practitioners provided assurance to clients on a voluntary basis for many years, and this means that they are quite familiar with their clients, which means that if they would be providing the assurance over greenhouse gas emissions, they could be biased by putting too much interest of the client, or putting too much reliance on the client's clients' workings, clients' results. So we were thinking about the situation. What happens when the mandatory greenhouse gas regime starts and our standards takes place? There would be some practitioners who were providing their services before the mandatory regime started. So we are thinking, we are considering if we should put anything in our standard about the safeguards against familiarity threats, and one of the commonly used safeguards is rotation for the engagement leader. So we are considering, should we include a requirement for rotation of engagement leader, and what this would be, 3, 5, 7 years, and how long would be the time off between the before the engagement leader can take the assurance engagement again. And also, should this rule apply to independent reviewer of the engagement? So this is something what we are exploring, and we would like to hear more views and more feedback. We will run the poll now with a question, and again, please share your views or any comments that you have about this familiarity threat.
Anna, just while everybody's answering the poll questions, Chris has a really good question that he's put in the chat. Thank you very much, Chris. So I have a question around assurance providers marking their own work. The standard is leading towards a lot of industry collaboration. Can an assurance provider, but by the standard, I assume you mean 3410 or the climate standards which are being developed at the moment, possibly. Can an assurance provider provide advice or scenarios for an industry organisation and then provide assurance over those industry scenarios? And I think that's a really good point that you raise, and I know that's something that the FMA are also considering in terms of, whether it is appropriate to use those kind of scenario analysis that's been done at a sector or an industry level, and then go on to provide assurance at the entity level. So absolutely, you're right to raise it, and that is something that we are specifically considering in terms of this exposure draft, this particular assurance standard. And Trent said he's got the same question, so yeah, it looks like it's a real issue. And Victoria's also asked a question, so we're getting lots of them thick and fast, which is great. Can you explain if you considered using the rotation requirements applicable for financial statement audits from PS1? What was the outcome of that thought process? It'd be fair to say, Victoria, we are considering everything at the moment, and yes, we absolutely did consider using those timeframes. Obviously, those timeframes, differentiate between PI and non-PI or FMC reporting into, it gets a little bit complicated along the lines, but yeah, absolutely, we are considering those as one of the possible. So we haven't landed on the outcome, to be honest, Victoria. That is just one beautiful ingredient that we're putting into this lovely cake that we're making at the moment. And Jackie has also added a comment: with all the changes happening in this area, would a longer period be better in the earlier years, reducing this to match PS1 in a few years' time? Yeah, I mean, possibly. I think one of the things that we considered initially was, is long association even an issue? Because, the intention, I think that Misha explained at the outset with this, for this assurance standard to have a short shelf life, in terms of just while the mandatory assurance is required over GHG emissions within the climate statement. And then, we get a bolder and broader assurance statement once assurance is required over the entire climate statements. But then, like people like Chris have pointed out with the scenario analysis, for example, what's happening now, people are already going out and getting voluntary assurance. So, we've had to go back in time and looking at log association and familiarity threats, as well as forward once this mandatory assurance comes into effect. So, yeah, some really good thoughts. It's good to see that you guys are thinking about the same sort of issues that we are. That's quite heartening, to be honest.
So yeah, I'll just jump in there as well, Nicola. So absolutely, to Victoria's question, we're considering our financial statement audit regime, but we're also learning from our ISO practitioners and our JASAN's accreditation regime rules. So for those of you who are on the call who have other professional requirements, we're really keen to understand your views around what is your professional requirement rotation regime. We understand that those don't necessarily align with the 7-year on, that it could be shorter. So we want to make sure we're getting all views and understanding all of your requirements that you currently comply with and what those rules and requirements relate to. So there's a lot of ingredients in this mix, to use Nicola's analogy. And yeah, we're just keen to understand more. So thank you.
And looking at the responses from our poll, it is 100% support for the safeguards against familiarity threats. Thank you for this. And 79% support for specific rotation requirements. 16% is still unsure. And let's have a look at the rotation time. So it looks like it's very even response. 33% thinks 3 years would be the best one, 40% 5 years, 33% 7 years, and then similar with 2 and slightly more people like 2-year time off than 3-year time off, and 74% support that the rotation requirements apply also to independent reviewer. Thank you for this. It's quite interesting to see this results, and it will be a really good material for us when we continue drafting our standard requirements. Is there any other comment?
We just had one come through, Anna, from Osana.
Yes.
Hopefully I said that right. Will this consider small practitioner with maybe 1 or 2 people doing the assurance? How will it be practically applied? And I think that's a really good point as well, and one that we are conscious that, to be honest, regardless of the size of the organisation providing the assurance, it's a really, really small market in terms of the number of assurance practitioners in New Zealand that, have sort of competence across GHG emissions. So yeah, that is a really important consideration to take into effect, but I'm not sure, like I know when the Auditor Regulation Act came into effect, for example, it was the same sort of thinking, and what we did see was alliances formed between smaller organisations, in terms of providing independent review, for example. So yeah, that's just one practical way if this were to find its way into the final standard.
Yes, and this is something what we are bearing in mind, that we do not want to create unnecessary barriers for the assurance practitioners. So yes, it's a valid point. All right, so I suppose we just go to the last slide on ethics and independence, and it's just a question for your views and your feedback. Are there any other independent circumstances that should be prohibited? And we were considering, for example, close business relationships or personal relationships. And there is a huge bunch of other areas that we actually included in our survey. So if you would when you go to the survey, you will see that we ask for assurance practitioners specific questions. Which circumstances do you think might arise and need further consideration for the standard? So any feedback from the survey will be very appreciated. And if you have anything that you would like to raise now, so that we could discuss now, it would be also great. No more comments at the moment.
Yeah, maybe I have a quick comment. Just, I guess it's around how open or how wide that could be in terms of relationships. Like if I think of, so I work for Assure Quality, we have a totally separate unit of the business, for example, that provides meat inspectors in meat plants. And so if we were going to do greenhouse gas assurance of a meat processor, like my area, the environmental area, it's totally unrelated to that. But, you know, if we were prevented from doing greenhouse gas assurance by that, that would be hard for us.
Okay, I understand. Yes, so I suppose when we will be drafting our requirements, we just need to make sure that we do them in the framework of the fundamental principles. So whenever there's a specific prohibition, is in the context of compliance with fundamental principles. And if any specific service might create any specific threat. But thank you for your point.
Robin's just raised a point in the chat as well, saying a statement regarding conflict of interest would cover some of the issues that people have previously raised, and also probably some of the relationship points in the on the slide. So yeah, that's really useful too. Thanks, Robin. Got a thumbs up from Victoria.
Thank you. All right, good. So if we do not have any other comments, then I would hand to Nicola, and she will talk us through the quality management requirements and reporting requirements.
Thanks, Anna. Ngā mihi nui kia koutou katoa I tēnei wiki o te reo Māori. Ko Nicola Hankinson aho. As Misa mentioned, I am currently on secondment at the External Reporting Board, assisting with development of this assurance standard, and I'm super excited to be here because, you know, it is a new area that we really are keen to get everybody's feedback to make sure that the standard is fit for purpose and allows us to go out there and perform really good quality assurance engagements. So quality is obviously a key consideration in designing the standard to ensure that stakeholders can trust and place confidence in the GHG emission information that's disclosed in the climate statements. In designing the standard, we're proposing, and I just really want to emphasize just proposing at this stage, requiring organizations that are undertaking the assurance to implement quality management processes that cover the following areas. So those of you from the financial statement audit world may be familiar with some of these terms from the newly rolled out ISQM standards. So governance and leadership, so considering whether the assurance organization is set up to identify and to respond to risks that impact on the quality of their GHG emissions assurance engagements. Ethical requirements, as we just discussed with Anna, so, you know, requiring individuals or organizations offering this GHG assurance services to take a proactive approach to identifying, managing risks to any threats, to complying with the fundamental ethical principles. So that looks like a really hot area of concern out there. Acceptance and continuance, so considering whether the organisation has appropriate processes in place to consider what GHG emission assurance engagements are accepted and which ones are continued with, bearing in mind some of the rotation requirements and competency and that kind of thing. Engagement performance we've got down there, but I think we also quite strongly mean engagement quality, so that's covering aspects such as supervision, review, and consultation. When you come across issues as part of these engagements, how you tackle those. Resources, so that's quite broad, so that includes your human resources, the staff, contractors, other experts engaged to assist with these engagements, as well as technological resources, so any firm methodologies that you use, intellectual resources, and the lucky last, information and communication, so covering how the organisation communicates and shares information with their assurance client, with regulators, within the assurance team, and then with any experts that they involve in the engagement. We're also proposing to include a high-level requirement around how assurance organisations are monitoring and remediating any quality issues that arise. So any issues that might impact on their ability to undertake a high-quality assurance engagement over these GHG disclosures. And the last proposal, which we would very much like your feedback on, is the introduction of an independent review requirement. So akin to an engagement quality control reviewer, from those of you from the ISO world, or an independent reviewer for those familiar with the ISO requirements. And there are also a few areas that we are still exploring. So these are the ones highlighted in yellow on the side of the slide, such as what the quality management requirements should be at the assurance organisation or firm and engagement levels, how specific the standard should be in relation to the requirements of the engagement partner or engagement leader. And we had some discussion in the chat earlier about the need to be clearly define what or who the engagement leader is, which is a really good point. And how specific the standard should be about the competencies that are required by the assurance team, both in undertaking assurance and in GHG emission quantification and disclosures. So a lot to consider, and we're also conscious that we don't want a super long standard, but we want it to be broad enough to result in really good high quality assurance engagements. So if we go to the next slide, Misha.
Did you want to do the poll now, Nicola?
Yeah.
Yep, I'll launch the poll.
You're a very good assistant. So yeah, do you support the risk-based quality management requirements? Is the question. So yes, no, or it's a good start, but it needs some refinement. I can see quite a few questions coming through or comments on the chat too, which is brilliant. Yes, some really good points there. Thanks, Jackie and Ram and Jessica. So we've got 40 people have responded so far, which is brilliant. So quite overwhelming support for incorporating the risk-based quality management requirements. Nobody against it, and a few people think it needs a bit of refinement, which I think we would probably all agree with, to be honest. Yeah, we're definitely not proposing a drop straight in a situation. So thank you very much for your responses on that one. So the next area for discussion is really what the most important quality management requirements to include within the standard are. So, when we talked about refinements, so in particular, what do you think about the independent review or the engagement quality review requirements, the engagement quality requirements at the individual engagement level? So, for example, the review, the supervision, and the consultation. the engagement partner or engagement leader requirements in terms of, what they are responsible for, and then drawing out competencies as well. So yeah, I'm not sure if anybody's brave enough to unmute themselves and let us know their thoughts. I mean, you're more than welcome to keep putting your comments into the chat box. It's really useful as well. Yeah, some of the things that we have been thinking about internally when we discuss these is the fact that initially, as part of the mandatory assurance regime, this is targeted to the 200 or so climate reporting entities. So it's the top level of entities within New Zealand. That so we're not talking little engagements. These are quite significant engagements. When we think, is it too onerous to require an independent reviewer? And we think, well, because of the overwhelming desire for people to be able to have trust and confidence in this information, we think it's something that is worth proposing and getting your feedback on. So that's one of the considerations. Yeah, we are also conscious that both the existing assurance standards, so the ISO standard and ISAE 3400 and 10 already have competency requirements. So another consideration is to what extent we include those within this particular standard. So yeah, Osana and Yulia are pointing out that they'd be supportive of competency requirements being included. Yulia says EQCR makes engagement more costly. 100%. Yeah, so I totally agree. There is a cost benefit decision to be made there. And then, as we went through previously with Anna about the ethical requirements, one of the key fundamental principles is professional competence and due care. So, is that enough that we trust assurance practitioners not to accept engagements if they don't have the underlying competence required, in terms of GHG emissions? Oh, this is the first time we've seen greenwashing included. Yeah, greenwashing is 100% a big concern. Yeah, I think the climate standards team, for sure, that would be the worst case scenario, that we just see a bunch of statements out there from climate reporting entities that nobody can trust. So yeah, absolutely agree, Jackie. Natalie, independent review to assure quality has to be really important, but how are you defining independent? Someone within the team, but separate to the engagement. I mean, that's a really good point too, Natalie. I think internally we were thinking that it would be someone separate to the engagement, but may or may not be with it, within the assurance organisation. I think, somebody that raised earlier, how does this apply to small organisations? I guess then you would have to go external for to get an independent reviewer. But yeah, these are all the live considerations. So I think we do have some polling questions as well on these, don't we, Misha? So if we maybe move to those. So the first one is a yes, no, or unsure. Should the standard require an independent review or an engagement quality reviewer? %, yeses so far. You're actually making our jobs a lot easier, to be honest. So thank you for all agreeing with each other. Oh, that's a really good point, Jessica. Thank you for that. So she just pointed out that ISO requires the independent reviewer to be separate from the engagement, and small assurance teams outsource independent review services. Yeah, thank you for that. And another good point from Victoria there. In terms of our expectations being akin to, certainly we want the quality to be as high as the financial statement audit. So we've almost got to our magic 40 respondents. We're sitting at 39 at the moment. think last time we got to 43, to be fair. There's 40. Okay, so we've got 93% of people think that the standard should require an independent reviewer. So we've got 3 people that are not sure, but nobody thinks definitely not. Should the standard include engagement level quality requirements? So we've got 85% think yes, and we've got 15% unsure. So again, there's no no's. Should the standard include engagement leaders' responsibilities? Very, very high response, and 98% of you think it should, and 1 person is not so sure. And then the last question, should the standard include requirements addressing competencies of the assurance team? And that's sitting at 90% yeses and 10 unsures. So yeah, like I think we discussed earlier in terms of the length of the standard, we don't want it to be super duper long, but yeah, we should be able to include these requirements in the exposure draft relatively concisely, particularly I think, yeah, with overwhelming feedback from you guys. So thank you very, very much for that. So if we move to the next slide. So that was quality management. So very, very important. And now we're moving on to the assurance report, because I think as assurance practitioners, you know, we're really aware that this is the key product that people see when, you know, looking at the assurance, you know, the GHG disclosures and the assurance that's been provided over those. So we think it's a really important thing for users to be able to get enough information from the assurance report in a consistent manner. So regardless of who has undertaken the assurance engagement, to be able to place their trust and confidence in these disclosures. Some of the specific issues or considerations that we have been grappling with are outlined on the slide there. So, you know, should we put the opinion if it's reasonable assurance, or conclusion if it's limited assurance first, so that it's quite clear to people reading it, you know, if they can trust it or not. Should we require a separate assurance report if the climate reporting entity voluntarily asks us to provide assurance over more information than is required under the legislation? Just so you know, it's clear, so we're not reading an assurance report saying we've provided assurance over these disclosures on pages X, Y, and Z, and not these. You know, is it clearer just to have a separate report? Should we require reporting of key engagement matters? You know, which is really similar to the key audit matters. So calling out and letting stakeholders know what were some of the big things that we were thinking, or the assurance team were thinking about when undertaking the engagement. We were also thinking about the use of emphasis on matter paragraphs to highlight specific disclosures, particularly just because of the nature of GHG emissions, those that involve significant judgment or inherent uncertainty, or potentially include some forward-looking information. We also have been considering using other meta paragraphs to highlight unassured comparative information, particularly in the early days of the regime, when you're likely to see, okay, that the financial year that, you know, over which mandatory assurance is required. Yep, we assured that, but the prior year that's unassured. For example, like, would another meta paragraph be an appropriate way to highlight that, along with probably the words unassured next to those disclosures? And then, should we require or should we encourage information on materiality? I think that's probably been the most contentious discussion within our broader team. So we've had some quite good discussions on that. And should we also require or encourage information within the assurance report on the qualifications and experience of others involved, or of the assurance team themselves? So, you know, going back to the competency discussion that we just had. So those are some of the things that we have been talking about. There's heaps of conversations coming through on the chat, which is great. So Heather said that emphasis of matter is important to be considered in sustainability assurance. Brent, they're going through thick and fast, but yeah, some really good points that you guys are raising there. So thank you. We will read all of them absolutely. So yeah, if we move potentially, and we've got some of the examples on the next slide, Misha. Yeah, just to, I think for us particularly, it helped to be able to see what these things might look like. And then we go, oh, okay. So this is just an example limited assurance conclusion. And so why we've highlighted in orange the last kind of bit in brackets there, that's just about alerting readers to what measurement criteria was used as the basis for the GHG disclosures, because you know, the climate standards don't mandate use of a particular measurement criteria. So we thought that might be something useful to tell readers. I think the rest of it is fairly straightforward. Acknowledging it is a long sentence, it's 6 lines. So yeah, based on the procedures we have performed and the evidence we have obtained, nothing has come to our attention that causes us to believe that ABC's GHG emission disclosures, blah, 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 for the year ended, blah, 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 are not prepared in all material respects in accordance with NZCS1, measured in accordance with. So yeah, 100% happy to receive any comments that you've got on the limited assurance conclusion. We just looked at the Commonwealth Bank climate report this morning, and the PwC had opined or given a limited assurance conclusion, sorry, on that, and it was pretty similar wording. So yeah, we think just if limited assurance is provided, we really can't go too far away from wording along those lines. I think the next slide, we've got some examples. Oh, yep, okay. So a few more things that we have been thinking about. We've been thinking a lot, as you can see, is whether it is useful to include an inherent uncertainty paragraph. We discussed key engagement matter and emphasis of matters and other matters, materiality and competence, and we also discussed the separate assurance. So yeah, it's just really time. I can see that, you know, there's lots of useful things coming through the chat, but whether anybody wanted to unmute and you know, let us know their comments on some of the things that we have been thinking about in relation to the assurance report. We're all a friendly bunch.
Nicola, maybe it's good on the next slide, we've got some illustrative examples, because I think it sheds some light on what we're thinking. So maybe we go through those illustrative examples, and we've got some polls, and if anyone wants to talk to the examples and gives us feedback on how we can enhance those examples, that'll be awesome.
Yeah, yep, absolutely. Yeah, so like Misha said, we just really wanted to put something up to get a feedback from you. So first up, we've got the emphasis of matter paragraph, so alerting readers to inherent uncertainty, key judgments or exclusions. So just whether you think that that would be useful, just to, I think one of the key things that we were grappling with was the, you know, call it the audit expectation gap or the assurance expectation gap. Just being conscious that we might be getting a broader range of people reading these reports than have previously engaged with financial statements, for example. So it's just really useful potentially for them to understand, you know, what we looked at, what we didn't look at. And then the next example we've got there is just the limitations in preparing the disclosures, and it being inherently uncertain because inconclusive science is used to determine the emissions factors, and the volumes required to combine emissions are estimated. So yeah, we have had some discussions internally around, you know, do we want a laundry list of caveats in the assurance report, you know, saying you can't rely on this because of this, or which is obviously not the intention, but yeah, just trying to strike the balance really around you know, what they can rely on and why. Osana's got a really good question there. Can you explain more around the mandatory and the voluntary assurance? So I'm not sure, Misha, did you want to cover that off in terms of, you know, the early days in the Act? It's the GHG disclosures, isn't it? But yeah, I'll hand over to you.
Yeah, so under the Act, as we started this conversation, it's limited to the greenhouse gas emission disclosures. The Act requires assurance over the greenhouse gas emission disclosures that are required to be prepared in accordance with XRB's climate standards. So that is what the law requires. So we're calling that the mandatory assurance. The law recognizes but does not require an entity to seek assurance over other matters. So it might be over the full climate statement, it's everything in there, or it might be over some other of the metrics and targets, for example. So there is an understanding that some entities are already seeking broader assurance and may think about slowly expanding their assurance, so possibly starting with greenhouse gas and then going metrics and targets and then going full climate statement. The law is very clear, though, that the assurance opinion over the mandatory assurance, being the greenhouse gas disclosures, needs to be separate from any voluntary assurance. So we're thinking about how to operationalize that in our standard. We want to make sure that practitioners are aware of that legislative requirement so that they don't inadvertently breach the Act. But we recognize that this activity is already starting to happen. So some entities will voluntarily seek assurance more broadly than what is mandated under the Act. This standard we're developing is focused on the mandatory side of things. If a client wants voluntary assurance, then again, there's no legislative hook that assurance has to be undertaken in accordance with XRB standards. XRB does have existing assurance standards that help. So 3000 is the broad umbrella standard. There is a guidance note, which sort of digs into some of the challenges in assuring all of this stuff. And there are other ISO standards that might be applicable as well. Our focus is in the initial couple of months focused on the mandatory assurance. So I hope that answers that question. The other thing I thought I might just mention, Nicola, is the use of the term emphasis of matter. Now, for those practitioners who are used to using XRB standards, that will be a very familiar term. For ISO practitioners, this may not be. So what is an emphasis of matter paragraph? In very plain English, and I tried to talk in analogies that people can understand, I use it as the auditor's highlighter. So really what it is it's a paragraph that says, I'm highlighting these disclosures that the entity's made. And it's just a paragraph that says, we draw attention to that note because of the importance of that disclosure in understanding what is disclosed. So because we are requiring compliance with either ISO or 3410, we are somewhat hamstrung by the terminology used in the one world. And so we are proposing to go ahead with this language of emphasis of matter because our ISAE practitioners, we understand, have to use that language. It's a requirement. So they would be in breach of the standard if they called it another title. Our initial engagement with some of our ISO practitioners is when they understand what this is about, it's my highlighter analogy, then they go, okay, yep, we can live with the heading emphasis of matter. But we're very open to hear your views if you've got concerns about that terminology as well. But that might just give you a little bit of context as to our voluntary mandatory and then also some of the terminology that we're using here.
Cool. So we've got the polling question available now around inherent uncertainties. So do you consider the assurance report should include specific paragraphs alerting readers to the level of inherent uncertainty? So we've got a yes, no, and a possibly option there as well. You guys are getting pretty good at this. So we're up to 37 respondents already. And Yeah, one brave person has said no, that they don't think that is appropriate to include in the assurance report. So that's really useful to know as well. And yeah, 89% of people have said yes, they think it would be, with 3 people saying possibly. Osana's raised a good point. So readers may not all be familiar with inherent uncertainties around emission factors, and it might make it clear to include it in the assurance report. Yep, that is definitely a consideration. And another person actually has just come through with a no for including, the level of inherent uncertainty in the assurance report itself. So yeah, really useful to get some broad feedback there. But yeah, we're still sitting at 87% yeses. I think the next slide we've got an example of.
Nicola,
sorry.
can we just pause? And I don't want to put those 2 who said no on the spot. So completely appreciate if you don't want to talk to us live. But if you wanted to send us an email or put some information in the chat about why you voted no, that would be really helpful. It's good to know that you think no, but it's even more helpful if we understand why you think no. So please, we encourage you to share that with us in some form that you're comfortable, please.
Cool. Thanks, Misha. Yes, if we can move along to the next slide. Another example to get reaction. So this is an example of the key engagement matter that we discussed earlier. So, what were the particular things that the assurance team spent time on as part of the engagement. So this is quite a specific farm example here with reference to an overseer model, which was completely foreign to me, to be honest. So I learned some things reading this key engagement matter, but it just includes an outline of why the matter was given particular attention, and then how the assurance team addressed this, so some of the procedures. So it doesn't include the results of those procedures, because that should be covered as part of the overall conclusion or opinion. So yeah, hopefully that's just useful to see that illustrated.
Nicola, it might be worth, just before we launch our poll, giving a little bit of context around, why are we even thinking about a key engagement matter? It's not something that is contemplated by either the ISO or the 3000 standards. So, you might be sitting there going, oh, what are these people smoking their socks now about? I can assure you we didn't come up with this idea. This has come up because through our previous engagement with practitioners, through this audience, we've been encouraged to explore all the tools in the assurance practitioner's toolbox. We've heard significant concerns from assurance practitioners about assuring specifically the scope 3 emissions. And we've heard that all of these different tools in our toolbox might be the solution to creating a meaningful assurance report that really provides the context of what this assurance is about, what it does and what it doesn't achieve. So that's why we are exploring this. We don't by any means think we've got the drafting of this exactly right. This is just an example of what it might look like. But what we really are interested in is not whether, we've got this disclosure right, because this would be the disclosure for the assurance practitioner to come up with. It would be up to you to come up with, well, what do I think the user really needs to know to understand more about what this assurance engagement is about? And that's what we are trying to model here. We're trying to say, okay, we've got the emphasis of matter paragraph, which is just a highlighter. We've got a plain vanilla, yeah, there's some inherent uncertainty kind of paragraph as an optional tool. But we see those as quite limited tools. And obviously, you as the assurance practitioner can include anything you like in your report. Our standard is just the bare minimum. But if we were to encourage or to require some kind of additional, more fulsome information about where the audit or the assurance practitioner put significant effort and what they did about it, specifically in this interim period, we think that that could be really useful in terms of a sandbox environment when everybody's learning from everybody else. It will promote transparency. We understand there's risks to that, completely get that. But I think that might just provide a little bit of context as to why we're even looking at this. We don't say this is what this key engagement matter must look like in any way. We're just exploring the different tools, if we should require these tools, if we should encourage these tools. We have been told that if we don't require, we're unlikely to see much of this reporting. So we don't want to use the big stick and say you shall require, but the more we talk to people, the more we hear that they think this could actually be really useful. So we need your help to shape what that really useful reporting could look like, so that all practitioners are consistently delivering the same kind of information. So that provides a little bit of context. With that, I'm going to launch our poll.
So here we go. Do you support the inclusion of the key engagement matter in the assurance report? People coming out of the box thick and fast. It's great to see. Yeah, I think one discussion that we had, with insurance practitioner initially was along the lines of, crikey, it's going to be a lot of work to draft these key engagement matters. But then, when sort of Misha discussed a little bit more about transparency, they kind of said, wow, actually, yeah, and I think that would be super useful. And maybe it's good practice as a team to think about, well, what are the, the key things that we've been focusing on. So yeah, lots of responses through. So we've got 77% of you think that you would support the inclusion of a key engagement matter paragraph. 14% possibly support, and 3 people on 9% against it. So like as Misha said, we don't want to call out anybody if you're particularly shy, but it would be really useful for us to know, in putting pen to paper and drafting the exposure draft, why you wouldn't support it, in terms of why you think it's not a great thing to include. So yeah, feel free to email us later on, or you're welcome to share your thoughts now as well.
Nicola, I haven't thought about this enough at all, but my initial reaction is just a bit of concern that this could be a bit misleading for users as to how much work has actually been done on the assurance engagement, because this is a limited assurance engagement, not a reasonable assurance engagement. So even looking at the example you've got on the screen, I mean, that third one, the factual accuracy of the GHG disclosures, that sounds like an audit statement, not a limited assurance statement. And given that limited assurance procedures are generally, they are quite limited. It's queries, it's analytical reviews. It's not the same level as a reasonable assurance engagement. So I would actually be quite concerned. I think that this could be misleading to users about how much assurance has actually been achieved.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point, actually. And like you say, I think when we drafted the example, we did base it on a reasonable assurance engagement. And I think that's what makes the standard so interesting, is that it could be a reasonable assurance engagement, it could be a limited assurance engagement. So we're kind of having to straddle the both. But yeah, because I think one of the things that we're really trying to do with the assurance report is minimize the expectation gap, certainly not to grow the expectation gap. That's not what we're trying to do here. Thank you for that. It's really useful. So I think we've got another example on the next slide on disclosure around materiality. So I think I mentioned that this is an area that we've really been discussing a lot internally, because the standard at the moment, in terms of the existing assurance standards, don't require split materiality, for example, so over scope 1 and 2 emissions, and then scope 3 emissions. But we have been having discussions, if you use your scope 3 emissions materiality across your scope 1 and 2, that all of them are likely to be immaterial, and you wouldn't probably look at them at all in any depth. So yeah, that's just an example of what inclusion of materiality within the assurance report might look like. So based on our professional judgment, we determine materiality for GHG disclosures as follows. So yeah, it'd be really useful. We do have a polling question on this, just to get your feedback on whether that is something that you would support or not.
So again, Nicola, just maybe a little bit of context. There is some differences between the two international assurance standards about transparency over materiality. So this is why we are thinking about possibly encouraging practitioners to consider whether putting that information in the assurance report is useful or not. We understand some ISO practitioners will be required to do that. So we could go as far as requiring, but we, as Nicola said, have heard strong fors and strong against. So we're trying to find a middle ground balance, and at this point we're thinking about encouraging, but we'll launch our poll and see if we get as diverse a range of views around this audience.
So there we go. We've got 3 options for you. So yes, you do consider it's useful to include information about materiality. No, you don't think it's useful, or possibly. You always like to have that option. So wow, quite strong support coming through. I think this is most probably one of the ones that's surprising me the most, to be honest. So 74% of respondents are in support of including materiality. And I mean, I guess, if we think about the expectation gap and what information we want to give to stakeholders to, make it clear what we did and didn't, what the assurance team did and didn't look like, maybe this is a useful tool. So, yeah, just one person not supporting including it. So that I probably expected a little bit more 50-50, to be honest. So yeah, that's really useful to know. And again, if you don't support it, or if you do, you're more than welcome to give us more information in terms of why that is. Yeah, either in the chat or unmute.
Again, Nicola, same reason as the last one. I'm just a little bit concerned that it again implies that the level of assurance is higher, because once you're talking actual numbers, that implies that you've done procedures that are quite precise in determining whether something is or isn't wrong.
Yeah.
And I guess I'm just a bit nervous that it again just could be a bit misleading for users. I think maybe some discussion about materiality wouldn't go amiss, but maybe not actual numbers, if you know what I mean, or actual measures, I should say.
Yeah.
Yeah, I haven't thought it through enough again, but that's just again my initial reaction.
Yeah, no, that's useful. Thanks, Denise. Yeah, absolutely. We were looking, as is currently done in the ISO and the ISAE standards, at including something around the roles and responsibilities of the assurance practitioner. So hopefully, that would include discussion around materiality and help bridge the expectation gap there. But yeah, all things that are very live issues that we're grappling with. So I think the next example, Misha, we've got.
Nicola, can I just jump in? What I'd also be really interested in, I'm similarly surprised by the level of support for this. But what I think I'd be given that level of support, and maybe we're planting the seeds of a few ideas. So, take them away, reflect on them. We welcome your feedback over the next couple of weeks. But given that high level of support, would an encouragement be strong enough? Now, I know we've got concerns from some practitioners, but for those who are strongly supportive, I'm very interested to understand if you think encouraging or requiring, because there's quite a difference. So plant that seed in the back of your mind, and as you're reflecting on all of that, we will be seeking feedback on those 2 aspects over the next couple of months as well. So thank you.
Yeah, and I think in the financial statement audit space, with the introduction of key audit matters, and I think, like Denise raises a good point, that's over a full audit rather than a limited assurance engagement. It was optional to include discussion around materiality, and we have seen some firms include it, and then we've also seen others not elect to do that. So yeah, we've seen a real mix coming out there. Yeah, so we can move on to the comparative information example. So as we discussed earlier, particularly in the early days of the regime, you know, the mandatory assurance over the GHG disclosures within the climate statements, some of this information will be subject to assurance and some will not, you know, for some years. So, you know, particularly for the first year of introduction. So the proposal that we were wanting to get feedback on was to include an other matter paragraph just to alert users to what has or has not been subject to assurance. So that's quite vanilla, what we've put up there. So the comparative GHG disclosures for the period ended, you know, 31 March have not been subject to assurance. As such, these disclosures are not covered by our assurance opinion or conclusion, as it may be. So yeah, just hopefully helps to see, you know, what that might look like. I think, yeah, thank you, Misha. So we've got the poll now for you. You're probably feeling over polled at the moment, but this is super useful for us and a really great way to get your feedback. So we've got 3 options there: yes, no, and possibly. So again, quite high. So yeah, I think we're seeing strong support across the board in terms of putting more information in the assurance report to let stakeholders know, you know, what the scope of the assurance engagement was. So 84% at the moment are in support, 13 possible support, and we've just got one person that wouldn't support it at the moment. So yeah, that's probably higher than we expected as well. I guess yeah, it probably does help, you know, in terms of educating people about the scope of the engagement. Oh, so Yulia's just added asked a really good point. So why comparatives are not subject to assurance? So yeah, thank you for raising that, Yulia. So I guess I may use the wrong terminology here, Misha, so feel free to interject. So, you know, the climate disclosure regime is prospective rather than retrospective. So my understanding is the first year of disclosure, those comparative figures, if they are included, are not required to be subject to assurance.
Yeah, so just one thing to add there, Nicola, too, is the assurance regime kicks off a year after the climate regime. So they will have 1 year of disclosures before assurance is required. So there's that. It takes a while for that. And we're asking for 2 years of comparatives. So it takes a while for that first year to wash through the system. And once people have been in the system, in the regime for more than a couple of years, their comparatives would all
be captured.
Be captured, would have been previously assured. So I think it's where we'd expect the assurance practitioner to cross-check that they've reported the same numbers, but not obviously to have assured those prior year disclosures.
So that's the key point, is this is probably a paragraph that's relevant in transitioning into the regime. If somebody has voluntarily had assurance over that number, then this kind of reporting obviously wouldn't be needed, but we didn't want to inadvertently bring in an assurance requirement over comparatives when the law is giving you an exemption from assurance in that first year. So it's just a way of addressing that transition into the regime issue. But very keen to hear your views if you think we should be doing something different rather than another matter. If you think there's something else we should think about, please do let us know.
Yeah, really good questions coming through. Thank you very much. Things that we take for granted, or potentially things that we have also grappled with internally and kind of finally got there and now take it for granted. So I think the next slide we have is another example for you in terms of competence and experience of the engagement team. So again, it's fairly vanilla. So another meta paragraph advising that our work was carried out by an independent and multidisciplinary team, including assurance practitioners, engineers, and environmental scientists. The assurance practitioner is responsible for the assurance conclusion provided. So, we've had a lot of people involved, but, the onus and the responsibility still sits with the, the assurance practitioner. So I think we've got a polling question for you on that. We've got two. So do you consider that it's useful to include information about the assurance practitioner's competence and experience in the assurance report? So we have a yes, no, and possibly range. Yeah, and the second one is whether it's useful to include information about the competence of any experts that have been used as part of the engagement within the assurance report. Yeah, I think this is something that we weren't sure about ourselves. Hey, that we've purposely included, to gauge feedback, whilst we are very much still in the drafting mode. So 50%, I think this is our lowest support so far. So 50% said yes, that would be useful to include. 19% possibly, and we've got 31% saying no. I think, yeah, one of the things we talked about earlier today was, you possibly would take it for granted that, the people that have undertaken the assurance engagement are competent and experienced. So, I mean, maybe that's some of the thinking behind the no's. And likewise for competence of any engagement. So we've got 41%. So I think that's the first time we've dropped below 50. So 41% would support that, 22 possibly, and 38% saying no. And that's really, really useful feedback. So yeah, thank you for that. Just in terms of, sorry, you go, Misha.
Yeah. So again, all I wanted to add is a little bit of context here. This is sort of something that in the 3000, so the practitioners who currently use our XRB standards, this is something that falls under the banner of long form reporting. And it's one of the matters that is in the standard, is something to think about. Where we're heading at this point, and I think our mixed views, mixed bags probably confirms we're possibly on the right track, is that we wouldn't require this, but we would possibly just encourage the practitioner to think about it. And that will result in differences in assurance reports, but this might not be something a difference that would be of significant concern. So I'll just add that as a bit of flavour and context. Thank you.
Awesome.
Very useful to get a mixed bag, because I think it, like you say, Nicola, confirms our mixed views on this, and
yeah,
possibly confirms our direction of encouragement. But if I've articulated that and it hits a nerve with you, and you go, oh, even encouraging is wrong, I would like to understand the why. So reach out at any point, share your views. Thank you.
And then I think on the next slide, we have our last example for you. So we are very much getting there. So this is an example of what an independent statement might look like. When we think back to Anna's session, and that seemed to be a really strong focus, particularly within New Zealand. We're all conscious of the size of New Zealand, and the nature of relationships. So we've got independent statement there. As we are engaged to form an independent conclusion on the GHG disclosures prepared by management, we are not permitted to be involved in the preparation of the GHG information, as doing so may compromise our independence. So that's quite clear, quite black and white. And then, as is currently done in the financial statement audit reports, disclosing any other relationships or interests that the assurance practitioner has with the underlying entity. So I think, Misha, is this our last poll? I think this might be.
I don't actually even think we've got a poll for this.
We don't have a
we
poll.
Might have,
okay.
we might have left you off the hook.
You're all polled out, but yeah, if you do have any comments, on, I think my take from the the ethics and independence session earlier on, was that this is a key area of focus for the majority. So yeah, please let us know if you do support the proposal to include such a statement. Obviously, you know, this will be included within the exposure draft, and then, you know, you'll definitely get the opportunity to comment there. Ollie said, is there not a risk with requiring disclosing experience that it inadvertently favours those with greater experience and thus possibly reduces pathways for lesser experienced practitioners to gain that experience? 100%, Ollie. Yep. Not something that we had particularly considered, to be honest. The approach we were going was optional disclosure. So what you might see is the more experienced ones disclosing it and the less experienced ones not electing not to until they build that experience, I suppose. But yeah, that's a really useful consideration. Thank you. Yeah, so we can move along, Misha. So this is really just a trigger if you have any specific comments around the inherent uncertainty of the GHG disclosures, or the inherent uncertainty of the assurance over the GHG disclosures, and then those two independence and other relationship statements within the assurance report. Would love to hear them. Would love to hear your thoughts on anything, to be honest. Yeah, so we can probably move along to the next slide unless anybody has anything specific to raise. Okay, so the next one is about whether you would support a separate assurance report for the mandatory assurance, so that it's quite easily distinguished from the voluntarily, the information that we have provided voluntary assurance over. So we've got a yes, no, and a unsure. Nobody's unsure. Everybody's quite sure that, okay, one person's unsure. Yeah, this is really mixed as well, and which is also very useful, because I think it's not something that we're clear in our own minds, you know, whether how many assurance reports do you want, for example, or yeah. So what, 45% at the moment supporting a separate assurance report, 35%, and it is still moving around a bit, wouldn't support it, would prefer just the one assurance report, and then 22% unsure. So yeah, again, that's really useful. And I guess we're conscious that, you know, what is required to be, you know, have mandatory assurance over, that will change over time too. So yeah, probably too early to draw a line on that one. So if we want
and that one, I think it's helpful just to reiterate, we're focused on the mandatory side. There is this fishhook in the law that we want to draw practitioners' attention to, but given that mixed bag and that mixed range, possibly something we would explore is not to be prescriptive and allow some flexibility. So it's really helpful feedback. Thank you.
So as Anna announced, we are launching a survey today. So following this session, we will send all of you a link to the survey. It's you know, not extensive. You've survived today's polling questions, so I think you'll get through the survey just fine. I think someone asked earlier if we're going broad with the survey. Our intention certainly is. We've often struggled in the past to get you know, a really good number of responses from users of this, you know, the financial statements or the climate statements, for example. So feel free to share the survey. We'll be including it on LinkedIn as well. And like I said, we are sharing it with Institute of Directors and the Shareholders Association. But yeah, the more that everybody can share it, the better, because, you know, it will just give us a better informed starting point for drafting this standard. So thank you very, very much for all of your participation today. We really appreciate all the comments, you know, all of the discussion, all of the input via the polling questions. And yeah, you're welcome to get in touch with Misha or Anna or I at any stage if you do have any other comments or questions as well. And
Nicola,
I think
before we open to questions, I might just reiterate for the survey, we're running the survey till the end of the month. So, you know, you might have some sparks that you want to think about after today, or you might want to go in straight away and just submit. But to Nicola's point, please do share as widely as you can, encourage the clients that you are working with, anywhere in your network. We would really appreciate your sharing that. We'll do our best to get as good a response as we can, but we in your hands as well to help us. So thank you for that.